April 1982. The North Atlantic Ocean, approximately 200 nautical miles west of Iceland. This location sits astride the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap, the strategic maritime choke point through which Soviet submarines must transit to reach the Atlantic Ocean from their bases on the Kola Peninsula. NATO forces guard this gap continuously during the Cold War, recognizing that any conflict with the Soviet Union would require defending Atlantic supply lines against Soviet submarine attacks, and that detecting Soviet submarines as they transit through the GIUK gap provides early warning and tracking opportunities that become increasingly difficult once submarines disperse into the vastness of the Atlantic. USS Gallery, an Oliver Hazard Perry-class guided missile frigate designated FFG-26, maintains station in these waters, conducting anti-submarine warfare patrol as part of NATO's standing maritime forces. Gallery displaces 4,100 tons and measures 445 feet in length, modest size for a modern warship, smaller than destroyers and cruisers, but substantially larger than Cold War-era destroyer escorts. The ship's crew of approximately 200 officers and enlisted personnel operates the various systems required for navigation, propulsion, weapons, and sensors. In the Combat Information Center, located deep within the ship's hull, sonar operators monitor displays showing acoustic data collected by Gallery's SQR-19 TACTAS, Tactical Towed Array Sonar System. At 14:20 hours, one of the sonar operators notices a faint signature appearing on his display. The signature consists of narrow band energy at specific frequencies, 120 Hz, 240 Hz, 360 Hz, harmonically related tones characteristic of rotating machinery. The fundamental frequency at 120 Hz suggests a reactor coolant pump operating at 7,200 revolutions per minute. Additional spectral lines at other frequencies indicate reduction gears, auxiliary machinery, and other mechanical systems, all producing acoustic energy that propagates through the water. The operator cross-references the signature against his classification database, a collection of acoustic characteristics for known submarine classes compiled through years of intelligence collection and analysis. The signature matches a Victor III class nuclear attack submarine, one of the Soviet Navy's most modern submarines, incorporating substantial acoustic quieting improvements compared to earlier Soviet designs. The operator reports the detection to the Tactical Action Officer, monitoring Combat Information Center operations. Contact, designated Sierra 12, bearing 047 degrees relative, classified Victor III class submarine, estimated range 68 nautical miles based on signal strength. The Tactical Action Officer acknowledges the report and passes the information to Gallery's commanding officer on the bridge. 68 nautical miles, more than 125 kilometers, represents detection range that would have been impossible for surface ships operating just a decade earlier. Hull-mounted sonar systems, typical of previous frigates, detected submarines at perhaps 10 to 15 nautical miles under favorable conditions. Gallery's towed array provides detection range exceeding 4 times that distance, creating tactical advantages that fundamentally alter anti-submarine warfare dynamics. Gallery's commanding officer orders the ship to maintain current course and speed, avoiding any maneuvers that might alert the Soviet submarine to Gallery's presence. The towed array provides bearing information, the direction from which the submarine's sounds arrive, but doesn't directly measure range. To determine the submarine's position, course, and speed, Gallery must maintain tracking over time, observing how the bearing changes and using those changes to calculate the submarine's movement. The sonar operators update bearing information every few minutes as the submarine continues transiting westward through the GIUK gap. The tactical team plots these bearings using bearing rate analysis to estimate the submarine's course and speed. After 30 minutes of tracking, the team calculates that the submarine is heading 270 degrees at approximately 12 knots, westbound at moderate speed, consistent with transit operations rather than tactical maneuvering. Gallery passes the contact information through secure tactical data links to other NATO forces operating in the area. A P-3 Orion Maritime Patrol aircraft receives the data and launches from Keflavik, Iceland, to refine the submarine's position and maintain tracking if Gallery loses contact. The P-3 deploys sonobuoys, expendable acoustic sensors dropped from the aircraft, creating barriers ahead of the submarine's predicted track. When the submarine passes through the sonobuoy line, the passive acoustic sensors detect it and transmit bearing information to the P-3, allowing the aircraft crew to calculate a precise position fix accurate to within a few miles. The P-3 maintains tracking for several hours, deploying additional sonobuoys as needed, while Gallery continues monitoring the contact on its towed array from 60-plus miles away. Throughout this 8-hour tracking operation, the Soviet submarine shows no indication of detecting either Gallery or the P-3 Orion. The submarine maintains steady course and speed, conducts no evasive maneuvers, transmits no communications, suggesting awareness of NATO tracking, and eventually continues westward into the Atlantic under continuous observation. From the Soviet submarine commander's perspective, His transit through the GIUK gap proceeds normally. His sonar operators detect no surface ships or aircraft nearby. His radio intelligence systems intercept no communications indicating his presence is known. And he believes his submarine is operating undetected, as doctrine assumes is normal for nuclear submarines operating quietly in open ocean. The reality is different. Gallery detected him from 68 miles away using passive towed array sonar maintained tracking without ever revealing Gallery's presence, and coordinated with maritime patrol aircraft that prosecuted the contact while the submarine remained completely unaware of NATO surveillance. This scenario repeated hundreds of times throughout the 1980s as Perry-class frigates operating across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans detected Soviet submarines transiting strategic choke points, tracked them continuously, and demonstrated that towed array technology had fundamentally altered the detectability of submarines that Soviet doctrine assumed could operate undetected in open ocean. Soviet submarine commanders increasingly complained in intercepted communications that American frigates detected their submarines before Soviet sonar could detect American ships, that approaching NATO surface groups without being tracked was becoming impossible, and that the tactical situation had shifted to favor surface ships over submarines in ways Soviet naval planning hadn't anticipated. To understand why Perry-class frigates created such decisive advantages and why Soviet surface ships couldn't match their capabilities, you need to understand both Soviet anti-submarine warfare limitations and the technology that made Perry-class towed array sonar so effective. Soviet frigates and destroyers, operational during the 1970s and 1980s, relied primarily on hull-mounted sonar systems that provided detection ranges of 15-20 kilometers against submarines, adequate for torpedo defense, but insufficient for prosecuting submarines at ranges where surface ships remained safe from submarine weapons. The Frigate-class frigate that entered Soviet service in 1970 displaced approximately 3,500 tons and operated with the MG-322 hull-mounted sonar, providing detection ranges around 15-20 kilometers in favorable conditions. The Udaloy-class destroyer introduced in 1980 incorporated improved sonar and added Ka-27 Helix helicopters with dipping sonar that could extend detection range marginally. But even these modern Soviet designs achieved detection ranges of only 20 to 30 kilometers. The tactical disadvantage this created was profound. Soviet surface ships needed to close within 15-20 kilometers to detect submarines with their hull-mounted sonar. But American submarines operating in the North Atlantic during the 1980s carried Harpoon anti-ship missiles with ranges exceeding 60 kilometers and Tomahawk cruise missiles with even greater reach. Soviet surface ships attempting to hunt submarines needed to approach within ranges where the submarines they hunted could engage them with standoff weapons while remaining outside Soviet sonar detection range. The hunter had become vulnerable to the hunted, a tactical reversal that made Soviet surface anti-submarine warfare operations increasingly hazardous and ineffective. Soviet doctrine adapted to these limitations by emphasizing submarine versus submarine warfare, accepting that surface ships couldn't reliably detect quiet submarines at safe ranges and assigning submarines the mission of hunting other submarines. Surface ships primarily served as helicopter platforms, using Ka-27 helicopters with dipping sonar to extend detection ranges somewhat, but this approach provided an only marginal improvement and required exposing helicopters to potential hostile aircraft. The Soviet solution to inferior surface ship ASW capability was building more submarines. If surface ships couldn't hunt submarines effectively, then submarines would hunt submarines. But this strategy required producing submarines faster than potential adversaries, and by the 1980s, the Soviet shipbuilding industry struggled to match NATO submarine production while simultaneously building surface combatants, support ships, and maintaining existing fleet. The Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate that solved American anti-submarine warfare challenges originated in the early 1970s, when the United States Navy recognized it needed affordable, mass-production frigates to replace aging Knox-class ships and provide comprehensive ASW coverage across both Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The program requirements emphasized affordability over individual ship capability. Rather than building small numbers of expensive, high-capability ships, the Navy would build large numbers of affordable ships optimized specifically for anti-submarine warfare. The design philosophy accepted limitations in anti-aircraft warfare and anti-surface warfare to concentrate resources on ASW capability, recognizing that carrier battle groups would provide air defense, and that the frigate's primary mission was detecting and tracking submarines threatening those battle groups and Atlantic convoys. The Perry-class design specifications reflected this focus. The ships displaced 4,100 tons fully loaded and measured 445 feet in length, modest by contemporary destroyer standards but larger than previous frigates. Maximum speed reached 29 knots, adequate for convoy escort and battle group operations, though not exceptional compared to destroyers. Propulsion consisted of two General Electric LM2500 gas turbines, producing 41,000 horsepower combined, driving a single propeller through reduction gearing. The single-screw configuration was simpler and more reliable than twin-screw designs, required less maintenance, and importantly generated less acoustic noise radiated into the water, a critical consideration for ships whose mission involved listening for quiet submarines. The reduced signature design incorporated numerous features minimizing the acoustic noise Perry-class frigates radiated. The machinery spaces included vibration isolation mounts separating equipment from hull structures, preventing machinery vibration from coupling into the hull and radiating into the water. The propeller design minimized cavitation, the formation of vapor bubbles that collapse, creating noise detectable by submarine sonar. The hull shape avoided sharp angles and protrusions that might create flow noise as water moved past the ship. These measures didn't make Perry-class frigates silent, but they reduced radiated noise sufficiently that the ship's own noise didn't mask the towed array's ability to detect distant submarines. The ASW sensors. Perry-class frigates carried included both hull-mounted and towed array sonar systems, serving complementary purposes. The SQS-56 hull-mounted sonar provided short-range detection capability, typically 10-15 nautical miles, sufficient for torpedo defense and prosecuting submarines once they'd been localized. The sonar operated in both active and passive modes, transmitting pulses and listening for echoes when actively searching, or simply listening for submarine-radiated noise when operating passively. But the real revolutionary capability came from the SQR-19 TACTAS, the tactical towed array sonar system that gave Perry-class frigates detection ranges exceeding any previous surface combatant. The SQR-19 TACTAS consisted of a cable containing 72 hydrophones distributed along its 1/800-foot length. The ship towed this array through the water at depths of 601,000 feet, far behind the ship where the array was separated from the noise Gallery's propellers and machinery generated. The hydrophones, essentially underwater microphones, converted acoustic pressure variations into electrical signals transmitted through the tow cable to shipboard processing computers. The array's length and the number of hydrophones provided directional sensitivity through beamforming algorithms that analyzed how sound waves arrived at different hydrophones along the array. Sound arriving from directly ahead or astern reached all hydrophones simultaneously, while sound arriving from the side reached different hydrophones at different times. By analyzing these time differences, computers calculated the direction from which sounds arrived, providing bearing information accurate to within a few degrees. The towed array operated passively, listening for sounds submarines generated rather than transmitting active sonar pulses. Submarines create noise through multiple mechanisms: reactor coolant pumps, reduction gears, auxiliary machinery, propeller cavitation, and flow noise over hull appendages all produce acoustic energy that propagates through water. Much of this noise occurs at low frequencies, 100 to 1,000 Hz, where sound propagates efficiently in deep ocean through the SOFAR channel and other acoustic propagation paths. The SQR-19 TACTAS optimized sensitivity for these low frequencies, detecting submarine machinery sounds at ranges of 50, 100-plus nautical miles under favorable conditions and 30 on 50 nautical miles in typical conditions. The onboard signal processing computers analyzed the hydrophone data continuously, filtering out background ocean noise created by waves, marine life, shipping, and geological activity, while identifying patterns characteristic of submarine machinery. Trained sonar operators monitored displays showing acoustic spectra, graphs of sound intensity versus frequency, looking for the narrow band lines indicating rotating machinery and the broadband noise suggesting flow over surfaces. The operator's expertise in recognizing submarine signatures and distinguishing them from background noise was critical to the system's effectiveness. Computers provided initial detection and classification assistance, but human operators made final decisions about contact validity and identity. The detection principle behind towed array effectiveness was straightforward. Submarines generated low-frequency noise that propagated long distances, and towed arrays separated from ship noise could detect these sounds at ranges far exceeding what hull-mounted sonar could achieve. The tactical advantage this created was decisive. Perry-class frigates detected Soviet submarines at 50-plus nautical miles, while Soviet submarine sonar, whether passive or active, detected Perry-class frigates at perhaps 15-20 nautical miles. The American frigates could maintain tracking from ranges where Soviet submarines couldn't detect them, could vector aircraft and attack submarines to prosecute contacts, and could provide early warning of submarine presence long before those submarines could engage surface targets. The armament Perry-class frigates carried reflected their primary ASW focus while providing adequate capability for other missions. An 8-cell Mk-13 launcher on the foredeck could fire standard SM-1MR surface-to-air missiles for air defense or Harpoon anti-ship missiles for surface engagements. Mk-32 torpedo tubes mounted amidships carried Mk-46 anti-submarine torpedoes for prosecuting submarine contacts. A 76mm gun provided anti-surface and shore bombardment capability. But the most important ASW weapon was the SH-60B Seahawk Lamps III helicopter that Perry-class frigates carried beginning in 1983. The helicopter extended ASW coverage substantially by deploying dipping sonar and sonobuoys ahead of contacts detected by the ship as towed array, refining positions from bearing-only data to precise location fixes, and prosecuting submarines with its own torpedoes. The cost per Perry-class frigate approximated $150 million in 1980s dollars. Expensive in absolute terms, but affordable, compared to guided missile destroyers costing $1 billion or more. This cost-effectiveness enabled mass production. At peak production, 12 Perry-class frigates were under construction simultaneously at Bath Iron Works and Todd Pacific shipyards. The United States Navy commissioned 71 Perry-class frigates between 1977 and 1989, creating ASW coverage that no other Navy could match. Dozens of these ships could be at sea simultaneously, covering strategic choke points, escorting carrier battle groups, and conducting barrier patrols across areas measuring thousands of miles. The operational dominance Perry-class frigates achieved during the 1980s and early 1990s fundamentally altered Cold War anti-submarine warfare. NATO established barrier patrols across the GIUK gap, where 4 to 6 Perry-class frigates covered 500-mile sectors with overlapping towed array coverage. Soviet submarines attempting to transit these barriers faced near certain detection. The frigates' towed arrays detected submarines at 50-plus miles, providing bearing data that allowed tracking and prosecution before submarines could approach NATO surface forces or Atlantic convoy routes. The statistical effectiveness was remarkable. Post-Cold War assessments indicated Perry-class frigates detected 75 or 85% of Soviet submarine transits across the GIUK gap during the 1980s, forcing the majority of detected submarines to operate cautiously aboard missions or accept that their movements were continuously observed by NATO forces. Typical operational scenarios followed patterns similar to USS Gallery's April 1982 detection of a Victor III-class submarine. A Perry-class frigate on barrier patrol detected submarine contact on its towed array at 50-70 nautical miles distance. The frigate obtained bearing information, but not range initially, as passive sonar provides direction but not distance. Over time, typically 30 minutes to 2 hours, the frigate maneuvered to obtain multiple bearings from different positions, using triangulation to estimate the submarine's position, course, and speed. Once the submarine's track was established, the frigate launched its helicopter or vectored shore-based P-3 Orion aircraft to deploy sonobuoys ahead of the submarine as predicted position, creating acoustic barriers the submarine would cross. When sonobuoys detected the submarine, aircraft crews calculated precise position fixes and either prosecuted the contact with torpedoes if in wartime conditions or maintained surveillance tracking if conducting peacetime intelligence collection. Specific examples from declassified operations illustrate the effectiveness. In 1984, USS Flatley, FFG-21, operating in the Norwegian Sea, detected a Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine at 82 nautical miles distance, an extraordinary range, even for towed array systems, and maintained passive tracking for more than 18 hours without the submarine detecting Flatley's presence. In 1987, USS Boone, FFG-28, operating in the Mediterranean, detected a Victor III-class submarine at 55 nautical miles and vectored an Italian Air Force P-3 Orion to prosecute the contact during a NATO exercise, demonstrating multinational ASW coordination enabled by Perry-class detection capabilities. Soviet frustration with Perry-class effectiveness appeared in intercepted communications analyzed by NATO intelligence during the 1980s. Soviet submarine commanders complained to fleet headquarters that approaching NATO surface groups without detection was becoming impossible, that American frigates acquired Soviet submarines at extreme ranges, and that tactical situations increasingly favored surface ships over submarines in ways that reversed traditional ASW dynamics, where submarines held advantage over surface targets. These complaints reflected reality. Towed array technology had shifted tactical balance decisively towards surface ships capable of detecting submarines at ranges where submarines couldn't detect surface ships or engage them effectively. The strategic impact forced Soviet doctrine changes. Soviet submarines shifted from direct approaches to NATO surface groups, and convoy routes toward indirect routes requiring longer transits through waters where Perry-class patrols were less concentrated. Soviet operational effectiveness declined 40-50% as submarines spent more time transiting and less time in areas where they could threaten NATO operations. Soviet submarine commanders operated more cautiously, assuming detection was likely, and planning operations accordingly rather than assuming they could approach targets undetected, as earlier doctrine had taught. The cost-effectiveness of Perry-class frigates created strategic advantages beyond just their ASW capability. The 71-ship program cost approximately $10 billion total, less than the cost of 10 Aegis destroyers. These affordable frigates provided ASW coverage that forced the Soviet Navy to maintain a 150-plus submarines to achieve desired operational effects, submarines that cost the Soviet Union more than $30 billion to build and operate. The Perry-class program essentially forced Soviet overinvestment in submarines, attempting to counter inexpensive American frigates, contributing to Soviet economic strain as defense budgets consumed increasing percentages of Soviet GDP, while producing decreasing operational effectiveness. The reasons Soviet surface forces couldn't match Perry-class capabilities reflected technology gaps, production constraints, economic limitations, and doctrinal choices that together prevented Soviet response to American innovations. The technology gap in towed array sonar was fundamental. American development of towed arrays began in the 1960s and continued through the 1970s, refining hydrophone sensitivity, signal processing algorithms, and operational procedures. By the 1980s, American towed arrays represented mature technology benefiting from decades of refinement. Soviet attempts at developing similar systems achieved limited success. Soviet hydrophones lacked the sensitivity American systems achieved. Soviet signal processing computers couldn't isolate weak signals from background noise as effectively, and Soviet operational experience with towed arrays remained minimal. Production capability constrained Soviet response even if technology had been equivalent. American shipyards produced 71 Perry-class frigates in 12 years, an average of nearly 6 ships per year sustained over more than a decade. Soviet shipyards built perhaps 20-25 Krivak and Udaloy-class frigates during the same period, reflecting limited industrial capacity and competing demands for submarine production, larger surface combatants, and support vessels. Soviet shipbuilding prioritized submarines over surface ships, accepting that surface ASW capabilities would remain limited while investing in submarines for both ASW and strategic missions. Economic constraints made mass production of advanced frigates difficult, even if Soviet industry could have built them. Each Perry-class frigate cost approximately $150 million, affordable for American defense budgets, but representing a similar ruble cost that consumed larger percentage of smaller Soviet defense budgets. Soviet economic planning struggled to justify building 70-plus frigates when submarines received priority and when Soviet surface doctrine emphasized other missions, including air defense and anti-surface warfare over ASW. The cost-benefit calculation favored submarines over surface ships in Soviet planning, creating force structure that emphasized undersea capabilities while accepting surface ship limitations. Tactical doctrine differences reflected these technological and economic constraints. Soviet Navy emphasized submarine production over surface ASW, concluding that submarines hunting submarines represented a more effective approach than surface ships hunting submarines given Soviet surface ship capabilities. The result was submarine versus submarine warfare where quieter submarines held advantages, and American submarines, with superior acoustic quieting, increasingly dominated these encounters. Soviet surface ships remained vulnerable to the very submarines they were theoretically designed to hunt, creating tactical situations where Soviet ASW forces were less effective than NATO equivalents across both surface and subsurface platforms. Training limitations compounded equipment deficiencies. The United States Navy conducted extensive ASW exercises continuously throughout the Cold War, practicing towed array operations, refining detection techniques, and building operator expertise in recognizing submarine signatures and distinguishing them from background noise. Soviet Navy exercises were limited by fuel costs, maintenance constraints, and restricted operational areas, resulting in less proficiency with equipment they did possess. Even when Soviet ships deployed towed arrays in the late 1980s and 1990s, Soviet operators lacked the accumulated expertise American operators had developed through years of continuous operations. The legacy of Perry-class frigates extended well beyond their Cold War success to influence naval warfare for decades. The ships remained operational through the 2010s, more than 40 years of service making them the longest-serving post-World War II American frigate class. Towed array technology became standard for all American and NATO anti-submarine warfare ships, proven as decisive capability that fundamentally altered submarine detectability and forced all navies to emphasize acoustic quieting as primary submarine design priority. Many Perry-class frigates transferred to Allied navies including Spain, Australia, Turkey, Poland, and Egypt, extending NATO ASW capability globally and providing these nations with advanced capabilities they couldn't develop domestically. Soviet and Russian responses to Perry-class effectiveness developed slowly. The Soviet Navy developed towed array systems beginning in the late 1980s, But these systems never achieved parity with American equivalents, suffering from technological limitations in hydrophone sensitivity and signal processing that reflected the 20 to 30-year American lead in this technology. After the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian naval development stagnated as defense budgets collapsed and shipbuilding essentially ceased for more than a decade. Modern Russian surface combatants incorporate towed arrays as standard equipment. But Russian Navy assessments acknowledge American technological superiority in underwater acoustics persists. Modern anti-submarine warfare continues evolving from Perry-class foundation. The United States Navy retired Perry-class frigates from active service during the 2010s, replacing them with littoral combat ships configured for ASW missions and the new Constellation-class frigates currently under construction. Both new designs incorporate advanced towed array systems building on technology Perry-class pioneered, with improved sensitivity, processing capability, and integration with other sensors, including maritime patrol aircraft, satellites, and underwater autonomous vehicles. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Detecting submarines at maximum possible range using passive acoustic sensors provides decisive tactical advantage in anti-submarine warfare. The historical impact of Perry-class frigates on Cold War naval competition was profound. These affordable ships enabled the United States Navy to dominate anti-submarine warfare without requiring expensive carriers and destroyers for every ASW mission, creating a cost-effective solution to the Soviet submarine threat. The frigates forced Soviet Navy into defensive posture, operating submarines cautiously under assumption of likely detection rather than confidently approaching targets, while assuming undetected status. The economic strain this imposed, forcing Soviet overinvestment in submarines attempting to overcome American frigate capabilities, contributed to broader Soviet economic problems, as defense spending consumed increasing percentages of declining economic output while producing diminishing military effectiveness. When USS Gallery detected that Victor III class submarine at 68 nautical miles distance in April 1982, the detection exemplified capabilities that fundamentally altered Cold War anti-submarine warfare. Soviet submarine commanders had assumed that nuclear submarines operating quietly in deep ocean would be essentially undetectable by surface ships, until approaching close enough that submarine sonar could detect surface targets, creating tactical advantages, allowing submarines to engage surface forces from positions of surprise. Perry-class Towed Array Sonar invalidated these assumptions comprehensively. American frigates detected Soviet submarines at 50-plus miles, beyond the range where Soviet submarines could detect American ships, beyond Soviet submarine weapons range, beyond any distance where Soviet submarines could approach undetected. The ocean that Soviet submarines relied upon for concealment became transparent to towed array surveillance, and Soviet submarine operations shifted from confident offensive posture toward cautious defensive operations under continuous NATO observation. Soviet submarines hid in ocean. Perry-class frigates turned ocean into aquarium, watched every move.